Love your enemies, do good to those who hurt you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you, love your enemies. Well, this sure is not the gospel I feel like preaching today. I've complained about these words of Jesus to every single one of my friends this week, and every one of them has laughed or said, I'm sorry. I mean, love your enemies. It's basically impossible, especially for me, or maybe for anyone living in a world so terribly divided, so sickeningly full of hatred, for anyone terrified by the rage of enemies who threaten the lives of our families, of rulers who gleefully smash and break institutions, wreck communities, terrorize the weak, and tear up the earth itself. For anyone who lives precariously among the ruthless strong, anyone desperate for protection or even the hope of protection from violence. Love your enemies. As my mother, a loving, generous person who maintained a reasonable, pacifist approach to political conflict. As my mother burst out once when she saw George Bush on television, I'd like to punch him in the snoot. I mean, that's just cartoonish as actual violence goes. And also, wow, George Bush? How quaint. My mother died before the first Trump presidency, and I wish I could tell her that I recently dreamed a generic bad guy, in this case, some kind of insufferable Proud Boy, was trying to push me off the sidewalk, and it made me so mad I punched him. Not exactly in the snoot, but it still felt great. And then, just to be sure, I grabbed his ear and twisted it hard. Okay. Maybe even if your politics are different, you share some of these feelings right now. Maybe you're a little sick to your stomach about the world and afraid and enraged about being made afraid and horrified and lost. Maybe you have all the feelings. I do. But the love Jesus talks about in today's gospel is not really a feeling. It's not about liking your enemies, whoever they are, or trusting them, or deciding it's actually okay for them to oppress people as long as they don't enslave or starve or kill too many. That's the good news. You don't have to like your enemies or gloss over their bad behavior. The hard news, though, is that loving your enemies is not an optional part of Christian faith. It is at the absolute, non-negotiable center of what it means to follow Jesus. What would that kind of love even mean? The love that Jesus embodies in his short and passionate life and death and resurrection is God's love incarnate, fully divine and fully human. And we, formed in the image of God, must learn to live more and more into the image we reflect, which means we have to learn from Jesus first how to become fully human if we're ever to learn to love as divinely as God does. I don't pretend to know the feelings of Jesus, but the gospel witnesses to his humanity. Jesus appears as human and angry, human and fed up with everyone around him, human and lonely, human and sad. Jesus is beset by enemies who want to destroy him and friends who betray him. Jesus seems to have thrown the occasional hissy fit, that fig tree, for example, and snapped impatiently at the most numbskulled of his disciples. But he never dehumanizes anyone, because he wants us all. And because, as he asks us in this teaching, if you're just good to those who are good to you, what's that worth? Jesus pours himself out for the unrelated, the undeserving, the ungodly, for crooked cops and women with bad reputations, for poor foreigners and the arrogant rich, even for the rulers and priests and sycophants whose cowardice and cruelty will kill him. Jesus' goodness is neither sentimental nor convenient. His love is not about feelings at all. It's about dragging us, all of us, together into the mercy and the life of God so that we might be one, which is still basically impossible. I can't be that good. I can't contort my feelings with a workaround that erases my uglier emotions, or talk myself into feeling a temporary gush of warmth and niceness toward my enemies. And if I try, even for a single waking moment, my unconscious will certainly rise up at night and entertain me with dreams where I get to punch the bad guys hard. The love I have for my enemies can't be about my individual feelings. No, the love I need is about doing unto others as I would have them do unto me. And this, as Jesus points out, is everything: the bottom line, the law, and the prophets. Not to feel unto others, but to do unto them. And you already know what that means. Feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit the prisoner, protect the stranger, give to whoever asks you. Oh yeah, and pray for those who curse you. Well, that's impossible too, which I think is why we have baptismal vows. Remember those? Will you renounce Satan and all the forces of spiritual wickedness that rebel against God? Will you renounce the evil powers of this world which corrupt and destroy the creatures of God? Will you seek and serve God in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself? Will you strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being? Remember that first of all, at baptism, we must gather to respond to these questions together in order to affirm that collectively we as a people, we support each other and we put our faith in God. And because it's meaningless for anyone, even with all that loving human support, to truthfully answer, I will, to these questions, at baptism we also promise, I will, with God's help. I will love my enemies with God's help. I will pray for my enemies with God's help. Because on my own, I don't want to. And on my own, I don't know how to. I have to undertake this baptismal conversion of heart by surrendering first to being loved, by rejecting the scarcity mentality around God's love, believing that it is truly poured out a good measure flowing over on me as it is on all people. I need to know to my core that I am loved, so that I can understand that just like my enemies, I'm one more of God's hapless, helpless, clueless children. And then I can maybe start to commend myself and my enemies to God's judgment, God's mercy, God's redeeming love for all. But we're still here, in this present darkness, with proud boys trying to push us off every sidewalk they possibly can. Let me share a striking section of the statement made a few weeks ago by the Council of Bishops of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, opposing executive orders signed by President Trump. "We must recognize," wrote the bishops addressing the church, "that we are at war and fighting, as the book of Ephesians warns, against spiritual wickedness in high places, against elected, ordained, appointed, nationalist, terrorist forces. This fight is not simply political, this is spiritual warfare. Therefore, we must put on the whole armor of God and fight the good fight of faith." Now, I'm very aware that spiritual warfare is a phrase that regularly gets people in trouble with its dangerous suggestion that maybe our enemies are God's enemies. You might remember the Inquisition, the Crusades, the Holocaust, Christian nationalism, any bloody interfaith or intrafaith battle where our side righteously decides to smash the bad guys and make them suffer in God's name. But the scripture the bishops quote is different. "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." We mere humans are, as Paul says in today's letter, perishable, sown in weakness. We are weak, flesh and blood, not even fully human yet, but still called alongside Jesus to struggle against the rulers of the darkness of this world. We have to heave ourselves, body and soul, against, let's be blunt about it, against Satan. That is, against the forces that try to tear us away from trust in God. The principalities that want us to believe God cannot love us and love will not save us. We are not called to wage war against other ordinary idiots like ourselves, on other perishable cowards like ourselves, on other angry, vengeful, lost children of God like ourselves. Because what is love for, after all? What does real love do? Love defends the whole flock. Love sacrifices and pours itself out, watering the seeds and the weeds both. Love plants the future. And the spirit of love is truth. So if we're going to try to love our enemies, we can't lie to them. We can't say, okay, go ahead, whatever, to their anger and bad ideas. We can't appease them when they're hurting the other human beings we're also commanded to love, or trampling on the rights and dignity of others. We must love our enemies as well as we can and commend them to God when we can't, so that we and they can become more fully human. Jesus, crucified and risen, shows that love comes at a cost in this world. I'm not ready always to pay that cost, though God knows God is. And so we come together, as we do this morning, to pray awkwardly, as we will, for our enemies and for those we have wronged. To pray for forgiveness, generosity, and love among all people everywhere, and for the coming of God's kingdom of peace. And yes, I know that sounds delusional. If elected, ordained, appointed leaders can declare trans people just don't exist, if the national parks are gone and immigrant children are gone and even the damn post office is going, what can it matter if an assembly recites some old words this morning? It matters only because hope makes hope possible. And love makes love possible. And your faith makes mine possible. And so we begin. During the very worst years of the AIDS epidemic, when the evil powers of this world abandoned millions to suffering and death, the epidemiologist Jonathan Mann insisted that the fight against AIDS had to be, above all, a fight against the dehumanization of undespised others. Mann died in a plane crash at the age of 51 before the battle was done. But he left these words: when the history of AIDS and the global response is written, our most precious contribution may be that at a time of plague, we did not flee, we did not hide, and we did not separate ourselves. The spiritual warfare we are called to now is real. We so badly need God's help, and we so badly need each other. If we are to learn how to love our enemies while struggling against the powers and principalities that are trying to destroy us all, we must not flee, we must not hide, and we must not separate. We are one body. We are called to do like Jesus and to become like him, fully human as we do. Let us live into the promises of our baptism and receive the saving love of God.